TARQ. We're very excited to have with us Sasanka Perera, who's going to be talking to us about cartographies of meaning and about understanding sociology in a contemporary art context. Sasanka is the founding professor of the Department of Sociology at the South Asian University in New Delhi and the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. After completing his PhD in social anthropology from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1991, he served in the Department of Sociology at the University of Colaba for 19 years. His research interests include contemporary social theory with an emphasis on the idea of culture and its politics, urban space migration, and politics of nationalism and ethnicity. His academic interests have enabled him to work in Sri Lanka, the US, Cambodia, Pakistan, Nepal, Japan, and India. He has written extensively and published both locally and internationally in English and Sinhala languages, while some of his work has also been published in Tamil, Japanese, and Spanish. He is also a poet and a blogger.
All right. Hena was worried about the crowd, but I was telling her that, last time I spoke on something like this, it was for 3 people in a hall meant for 150, so this is already much better than that. Anyhow, today, I want to pose a very simple question, and that is, how and why should sociologists like me look at contemporary art to read society and its politics? Art is not considered a serious object of research or potential method of research in mainstream sociology in India, our region in general, or elsewhere in the world. So art is too soft. But is it completely unthinkable that specific kinds of art, such as what is known as political art, these kinds of things that you see on these walls today, if read carefully, might open doors to unlock meanings of societal processes and politics? Is it completely unthinkable? Can't discourses on violence, politics, and other issues, social issues, and memories of such events be embedded in texts that do not depend on the written or the spoken word? If so, would this not help further expand the possibilities of sociological research? I'm specifically thinking about the narrative possibilities of contemporary art, and particularly such possibilities in political art, in the study of violence, war, pain, and memory. Is it impossible for sociologists to think that works of contemporary art might be repositories of memory, that they can be narratives of violence, that they might be worthwhile terrain of ethnographic inquiry? To answer this question in a preliminary sense, and I stress the word preliminary, I will first attempt to frame my general question more specifically in the context of recent thinking on the politics of art. From that point of departure, I will undertake a brief visual tour of contemporary Sri Lankan art quite informally and explore how these works read recent Sri Lankan politics. Second, I will attempt to locate some of the works of Pala Pothupitiya, these kinds of things that you see on the walls around here, which are currently on display at this gallery, within this broader socio-political context. After all, he is a product of his times, and his works reflect contemporary anxieties. Finally, I would attempt to suggest that contemporary Sri Lankan political art can be understood as repositories of personal and collective memory, as well as narratives of recent social and political history, and therefore relevant for sociologists in methodological terms. Let me briefly begin by diverting your attention to a painting which all of us are quite familiar with and have nothing to do with our part of the world. I have in mind Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which depicted the 1937 bombing and devastation of the infamous Basque town which carries the same name. The incident was one of the best documented cases of political violence in the first part of the 20th century. the futurist artist and critic Gino Severini made the following observations in 1946 with reference to Guernica, the painting. This is what he said. There could be no severer condemnation of the bourgeoisie and the fascist systems with which it defends itself than this magnificent picture, Guernica. In works of this kind, and especially in that great picture, he reached extreme limits of expression and abstraction of an almost monstrous representation of all the evils which have led to war and for which the whole world is responsible. Over 20 years ago, when I first began to think of expanding the methodological domains of sociology, and when I first encountered Severini's essay in a second-hand bookshop in Los Angeles, I wondered if a painting can contain such depths of feeling and expressiveness of politics, pain, and violence, why can't such works, as tangible texts, speak authoritatively to sociologists? What I will say today is based on that initial thought and subsequent and incomplete thinking on the idea which has followed me since that time. Picasso, in this particular case, did not simply produce a painting for someone's living room or for somebody's museum. Rather, he produced a painting that had specific political narrative that was effectively communicated in the context in which it was produced. And that message has traveled well beyond that time to the present due to the preservation of that work along with the discourses of art history it has since generated. So it speaks across generations. Other than Guernica, other works of some artists within the annals of modernism have come to be accepted as politically informed art whose aesthetic sensibilities are no longer questioned. As such, the works of the surrealists in general, Kolowitz's work, which focused on the working classes, and George Grosser's satirical visual language, have come to occupy a permanent place within modern art as works which engage with politics. Despite such well-known examples, however, the relationship between art and politics within modernism has been difficult, while a lingering discomfort in mixing politics with art has endured up to now around the world. This was mostly due to the perceived risk an artist has to take in venturing into politics through his or her art, which might be interpreted as banal or naive. Even so, we know quite well that very expressive political art have been produced in California in the 1960s in the context of the Vietnam War and the American Youth Movement. These are well-known cases. In the context of the, and in Thailand in the 1980s, in South Korea at the same time, and many other places. Despite similar and somewhat deep-rooted reservations on art's relationship with politics, post-1980s period in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka has also seen the production of a range of political art responding to their own socio-political circumstances. It's not that when I take examples from America, it's simply because they are better documented. It doesn't mean that our part of the world hasn't produced this kind of work, but unfortunately they are not that well documented yet. In the book, Mortality, Immortality, The Legacy of 20th Century Art, with reference to 20th century, with reference to how 20th century art would be remembered in the future, Miguel Angel Corzo observes as follows. This is what he says. If we accept the notion that art reflects history, then contemporary art is in some way a monument to contemporary civilization. It is the cultural heritage of our time. Within certain limits, I think Corzo's observations create an avenue to pose a series of questions which might inform sociological research. One of these questions has to do with how notions and experiences of pain, war, and trauma might be represented in visual arts. Yet another question is whether art reflects history and if it represents a particular civilizational attributes of a particular place or moment. If so, what kind of histories would art narrate? What would it not narrate? Who narrates these memories and who are the consumers? What are the absences and silences in these narratives? These are the questions that one has to ask if you are serious about making art talk to people like me. My personal conviction is, if we can successfully pose and answer these questions, then contemporary political art could become audible in a manner that would make sociological sense. But how exactly one should do this remains to be resolved. Caroline Turner, the Australian art historian, talking specifically about contemporary Asian art, has noted that political and social changes in the region and beyond have been mirrored and reflected in the region's art, and that individual changes within countries have significantly impacted upon the development of art practices in these countries. And she is looking at everywhere from Pakistan westwards, eastwards, right up to Japan. In this regard, she also notes that artists can, through their work, reflect the values and aspirations of their own society and of humanity. While some react with cynicism and even despair, others produce an art of resistance. Over the past decades, many artists in the Asia-Pacific region have protested colonialism and neo-colonialism, global environmental degradation, cultural loss, illness due to poverty, sexual exploitation, social political injustice, war, violence, and racism. Their work is in the broad area of social justice. Don't these constitute the very same areas of interest for sociologists working on political violence, issues of culture, discrimination, and so on? It is in this context, marked by specific local political conditions and global concerns, that Indonesian artists in particular have produced a significant collection of work opposing human rights violations in their country, often facing personal dangers in the process. According to Jim Supankat, these particular tendencies manifested in the 1990s, and in terms of one such tendency, artists were interested in locating the truth based on morality. This is what he says, truth based on morality. The other tendency, represented by artists such as Dadang Kristanto, Tisna Sanjaya, and others, critique the government as a collective of oppressive, corrupt, and powerful group of people who deceive the poor. Kristanto is perhaps the best-known Indonesian artist who has consistently narrated in his work extreme conditions of human suffering, such as the work he and 3 others presented at the 50th Venice Biennale in 2003 under the theme Paradise Lost, Mourning the World. In this series of works, the artists took as their point of departure the Bali bombing incident, in which over 200 individuals died. Similarly, Thai artist Vasant Sitiket has commented on issues of war in Iraq and corruption in Thailand in a shadow puppet-based work called The Truth is Elsewhere. Earlier, in a painting titled If the Buddha Came to Bangkok, he depicted the image of the Buddha among scenes of corruption and social dislocation, thereby commenting in a very graphic and easily communicable fashion his own thoughts on the events surrounding the 1992 coup in Thailand. I would situate the most powerful and influential Sri Lankan visual art practices of recent times within the kind of political art genres I just referred to from other parts of the world. So to me, the kinds of things that started in the 1960s in California, and the kinds of things that you see in Indonesia and so on and so forth is not that different. All these people were commenting on issues that they felt, that they were part of. And Sri Lankan artists, you will see in a little while, are doing exactly the same thing. And you do find this kind of situation in Pakistan for sure, in India, with regard to some artists, talking from Bombay, Mumbai, sorry, this work with this ARPA project that, when was it, 2002 or something, no? That with Shilpa Gupta and across the border. See, so this is not a genre that is unheard of in our part of the world. It's, in a way, it's fairly well established. But for some reason, commentaries on them and how these kinds of things might actually help us, people like me, read politics is not something that is of interest, to, at least to sociologists. So, the kind of Sri Lankan art I would refer to today, within which Pala Pothupitiya's work is also squarely located, has been called the art of the 1990s. This is because they found their genesis in the 90s. As a genre of work, they are located in the experiences of political violence in the recent past as their collective point of departure, as well as their obsessive attention. Jagat Veerasinghe, artist and art historian and archaeologist, identify two significant and broad thematic preoccupations in the art of the 1990s. This is how he explains it. Works that investigate the self and individual sense of being who have been victimized and made frustrated as a consequence of organized violence. Two, works that investigate the allure as well as the frustrations of the city as an artistic expression. So you have these two things, the city and political violence. Veerasinghe has suggested that the last decades of the 20th century, in which most of these works are produced, stands out as a period of extraordinary revitalization of art in Sri Lanka, which paved the way for a diverse and multifaceted practice of visual arts in the country. This trend continues well into the second decade of the 21st century. Most such works were produced in the backdrop of extreme social and economic upheavals, specifically marked by the militarization of the interethnic conflict involving segments of the Sinhala and Tamil people, as well as the attempted insurrection staged by the Sinhala-dominated People's Liberation Front and the counter-terror campaign of the state unleashed to contain these two situations. These circumstances, according to Veerasinghe, produced the idea of the artist as a political individual. Up to that time, artists were seen as people who just were free-floating kind of, people who express themselves as they wish, not as a political individual. So art of the 1990s, to which Pothupitiya's work also belongs, artists were conscious, these kinds of artists were very conscious that they are acting with a certain kind of political consciousness. Most artists who represent this way of art making emerged as a group of people living with memories of violence, dispossession, and despair on the one hand, and on the other as the casualties of the alluringly strange beauty and the evasive nature of urban culture. For some, this was an intensely personal experience, while for others, it was part of a collective experience. It is in this context that Veerasinghe has aptly articulated that their creative process was a struggle through which they transformed the realization of their oppressed and marginalized position in society into a dynamism that allowed them to surmount their despair and gain subsistence in the very society that rejected them in the recent past. However, for many of these artists, the mere conversion of their memories and experiences into commodities with a price tag was not the only matter of concern. The fact that some of these works sold well, particularly among the community of overseas patrons based in Colombo and a handful of contemporary museums in Japan and Western Europe, is a secondary consequence. The negative cultural value attached to themes like death and violence in the Sri Lankan cultural terrain, and the often violent and devastating visual language used in many of these works ensured that they were often locally labeled as inauspicious, ashubh, to use Sanskrit, and therefore were not considered something to be owned and certainly not something to be displayed. Well aware of these cultural limitations, these artists nevertheless continued to engage in their work. While some managed to sell them, many others did not. But as a collective discourse, these works made their presence felt mostly because of the epistemic break in art making they introduced, and also because of the discussions they generated at societal level. Let me now take you on this brief and somewhat unstructured visual tour of contemporary Sri Lankan art, which will also include some of Pala's initial work. And I will, I'll have a few more things to say after that, but this will be a very, I mean, I didn't have time to organize them in any kind of temporal order. So they will show the kind of work that I'm talking about, not necessarily in terms of when they were produced. So how does this work? Here. See, the way it has been organized is that you have the name of the artist and the artworks, names of the artworks, and here I've just given a very basic kind of general theme under which he's operating. You know, this is basically what it is. So I'll just run through this, but I will make some comments. Now, see, you will see immediately that the only way to understand this kind of stuff is through the politics of that time. I mean, if you remove politics out of it, it doesn't make any sense. So this is why I am saying my question about whether these kinds of works inform sociologists comes from that connection, right? Now, Chandragupta Tenwara produced something called barrelism, and I'll show you a better example here. See, for 15 years until the war ended, he was working on the idea of the barrel, right? And these kinds of barrels. So why is it obsessive? That it became an obsessive focus for him is because the personality of the ordinary metal barrel completely changed as a result of war, right? And he took that as a kind of a symbol, in the sense that this was something that nobody took seriously. It was simply a container. But with the war, they were painted camouflaged, and they became things that created certain kinds of hurdles against travel. I mean, security and so on and so forth. So everywhere in the city, everywhere in the countryside, you could see these barrels and sandbags stopping movement of people and the movement of terrorists as well. So for him, it was a kind of a symbol that identified the change of a pre-war society into a war society, right? And this is all he did during that time. Same thing. And they were produced, displayed inside galleries like this one, and outside like this one as well. Huh? They are, originally this is the kind of, these contain chemicals for road construction and so on. And then what happens is once they are used in countries like ours, they get reused for other purposes. But during the war, they became barriers that were placed in front of police stations, military stations, government offices, and so on and so forth, filled with sands, you know, and then barbed wire and so on and so forth. And the tricky thing, not the tricky thing, something that is very interesting is, we are talking about a 15-year period, right? And during that time, they became natural part of the cityscape. So they became permanent. Radios were placed on these things. Flower pots were placed on these things. People, military were listening to cricket matches. Oh, okay. So it became naturalized. But it remained a symbol of war. Okay? This is the kind of thing, I don't know about India, but in Sri Lanka, this kind of flower arrangement is only seen at a funeral, right? So the difference is this guy, you know, he burned the flowers. And the moment you burn it and it becomes black, then it has that additional symbolism of being inauspicious. This is the same artist as here, but this was his original, not original, this is about 10 years old, 12 years. During the war, one thing that happened in the Sinhalese-dominated South was to create the soldier as a war hero. Now, Sri Lankan military was nobody took it seriously until 1980s because it was a ceremonial army, but then over time it became a fighting force. And this idea of a war hero, Ranaviru, Veer from that word, Sanskrit word Veer, so war hero came out. So what he's tried to do is this, the idea of the war hero was presented in such a way that this character was almost godlike. So this is why he's in the clouds, right? And some of the motifs are from this Buddhist iconography that the artist is very familiar with. So the point that he's trying to make is, in the discourse of the war hero, death and maiming of these people were almost glossed over, even though that is very much a reality. So he's trying to say that these people are also dying, because even though death was very much part of what the military experienced, it was not something that the government wanted to stress. So he was trying to stress that and making the claim that you have to understand their sense of humanity too. So there are a number of artists at that time were trying to do that. But in their own words, to rediscover the humanity of the soldiers. So to, in other words, to remove them from this hero mold. Same thing. These are the ancestors of these. And mythical landscape, again, you see some of the features here, even in these, some of these ones. He was trying to do that. See, the military conflict in Sri Lanka was basically a conflict over a map. It was a cartographic conflict that became very violent, because the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam wanted to control this part of the country, and the rest of the people did not want to let that happen. So it was a fight over map, basically. But then it had all kinds of connections with India and China too. So he was trying to explain some of these things, because you will see these teeth coming out of various parts of India and the dragons coming from China and so on, because these, both India and China in different ways were involved in this conflict as well. Same thing. Beautiful explosion, this guy only did this work, and then it just disappeared. But it made a very important statement about the way in which political violence was glorified. It became almost like something to gloat over. The military victories had certain kinds of epic beauty in them. This is what he was trying to comment on, that its pain was camouflaged. This is the interior and this is the exterior of a monument that was built for young people who disappeared in the 1980s with state sponsorship. And all these things represent an individual who was lost. This the kind of generation that was lost. And this is supposed to symbolize the kind of funeral pyre that you see in the Sri Lankan funeral context. The point is, this itself has disappeared. It's called the Monument for the Shrine of the Innocents, but even though it was built with state sponsorship, the state itself removed it over the last few years, so it no longer exists. Well, they said it's ugly, that we want to use it for better place. So now there is a very beautiful garden. So I think it was a erasure of a certain kinds of monument that was in public space too close to the parliament. So they wanted to remove it, and it's been removed. Same artist, Jagat Veerasingham. This kind of thing, it's known as the Yantra Gala. What you see in the pre-colonial period, this was made out of stone. So all these compartments had religious objects, and they were buried, and the stupa was built on it. So it had ritual validity. Now, and we had this system of worship in the Buddhist scheme of things, where it's very similar to what goes on in India, where people go from place to place over a period of time, from one shrine to another, as part of a single pilgrim cycle. But in this period, in the 80s, when the violence, political violence was at its worst, parents had to go from military camp to military camp, from police station to police station, looking for their disappeared. So he was commenting on that. This is only a small part of the overall artwork. Again, same artist. This is a light box. 1980s also saw a very serious routinization of violence in Sri Lankan society, and he was commenting on that. Same team. But here he specifically, because of the title, Celestial Violence, this was part of an exhibition that had the same title, and he was looking at the role of religion in justifying violence in Sri Lanka, in particularly Buddhism, or institutional Buddhism. All these have to do with generalized violence. T. Shanatanan is from the northern part of Sri Lanka, from the Tamil Hindu belt. Obviously, I think this picture speaks for itself. It's this is same artist but produced outside of Sri Lanka, outside of the northern province. You can see this. What he wanted to say was that in Sri Lanka, nothing is what it seems to be. So you have this thing that looks like paradise. You touch it, it's very hard. So it contradicts the idea of paradise. You may remember that I mentioned the Veerasingha's explanation of Sri Lankan art. He says that the point of departure for these works come from two sources, either as a collective experience or as a personal experience. Chandrasiri is one of those people who's commenting through personal experience, who's one of these guys who were picked up by the military, tortured for a number of years, and mostly his hands. So he has this obsessive focus on hands, and it's usually placed on these beetle leaves, which are given to people when they meet each other. Same thing. This is the main icon of his work, but the difference is here it's placed in a house that was also that is also by itself a site of violence, where a bomb explosion took place. Same artist. The word thug, which obviously you know where it comes from, but in Sri Lanka it's used to refer to a what's the English word used in India? Hooligan, kind of political hooligan, who's in the payroll of politicians, who was everywhere. So what he did was to create this picture, and he would go and place it in different places and just go away. So because to make that comment that these people are everywhere, and then people will come and talk about it in that kind of thing. I miss my friend. This is a reference to disappearances, because this is the generation that grew up with violence right around them, either personally experiencing it or collectively. Bandhu Manamperi, this is in Australia, performance. Again, bandaged, you are referring to, see, he is using the body itself as a place where the wounds of the society was embedded, right? This is much more clearer. This performance was happening before the war ended in the public library in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka, where at that time there were no books because the books had been burnt. The library had been rebuilt, so they were doing this performance in the presence of the military and the LTT, commenting on the same thing. Same artist, but this is post-war, after 2009. And by the series is called Numbed. And what these guys were trying to comment on was that there was an expectation that 2009 the war ended, it was very violent, and after that there would be some kind of reconciliation and opening up of things. Didn't happen. So it didn't happen for quite some time. So for these people, there was a feeling that the body and the mind couldn't comprehend what was going on. So he was trying to comment on that incomprehensibility by saying it is numb. You don't feel anything anymore. This was his own body, by the way. So, No Glory, these are installations made out of terracotta, but based on the personal effects of people who had disappeared. So the idea was that if you are a political leader, you will have a museum or a monument for yourself. But when you're ordinary people, nothing. So how does memory work? So he was trying to turn the gallery into a monument, a monumental space, like this. Like the barrels, this whole camouflage kind of designs invaded the country everywhere. T-shirts, barrels, walls, and military vehicles, and so on. So by calling this the camouflage landscape, he's also talking about the infusion of military and political violence kind of ideas into everyday landscapes. Broken dialogue. This was specifically created for an exhibition in northern Sri Lanka, and you have these books which are burnt, and then there are these strings linking the books as well as these little things made out of cotton supposed to indicate people. So she was trying to say that somewhere along the line the dialogue between the two main ethnic groups were ruptured. A similar kind of same exhibition, same place, remaking in the sense that what the artist has done is these are containers of water, and these are pots that are cracked. She had tried to put them together. They look okay, but they are not perfect. So she was trying to deal with the idea of what happens after war, even if you put certain things together, whether the relationships would be the same, that kind of question. Again, exhibition from the north. You see a body that is scarred, and then over, let's say, 2.5 hours, she put pasted these colored pieces of cloth on the body. One interpretation is she was preparing a body for funeral. Another interpretation was she was putting color on a society that had died. And so there are these two different interpretations, but it's only female artists who were talking about somehow moving beyond violence, both this and the early artists, whereas the male artists, there was this obsession with violence itself. Again, like the Paradise Bed by Shanathanan, you have this beautiful dinner table, but nothing can be eaten because it's all burnt. So it's again that commentary is There is this seeming beauty, and then there is certain kind of harshness underneath. Same artist, Moving Soldiers, again he was also trying to comment on the non-heroic aspects of the soldier. That there are things about these people that the state does not talk about. Sujit Ratnayaka works only in black and white, and now this, I mean, the theme is pretty clear. This is the bomb that nearly killed the former President Chandrika Kumaratunga. So this was also shown in the northern province, and it created a lot of problems, because here was a Tamil community, and there was a lot of unhappiness that why are you talking about a bomb attack kind of thing, because it was in the midst of a society from which some of these guys might have come from. Don't Measure Me by Amarajiva is another anti-war kind of thing, because as the war spread, the requirements for the military, I mean, you needed more people, but the physical requirements were reduced. Because they did not need tall people as long as they could fight. So this is what he means by Don't Measure Me. Welcome to the Eastern Province, this is where he comes from. The tourist posters used to say this kind of thing, but he's commenting on the violence in the East. This is called History of Histories. Every container, there are 500 of these. These were supposed to be bookcases in which the books have disappeared from the Jaffna Public Library. So all these Coca-Cola bottles now contain something that has been donated to the artist by people who have been victimized by war. So something, it could be a driver's license, a lamp, a statue, something. So that is why it's called the History of Histories. This is the history of the people in Jaffna town. Okay. Now we go to these things. See, you will see that Pothupitiya's work has come a long way. So he's commenting on things like violence, the idea of the soldier, and now with this obsessive focus on maps. Maps and land use maps, as well as maps of fortresses. Now, to put it in a fairly simple fashion, he's restating the fact that maps were part of the reason why this war began in the first place, right? So that is why you will see this, the sword, which is part of the Sri Lankan national flag, coming out of the map, because it is inherently violent in that sense. That it is precisely to keep an ethnic identity upon the land that the war became necessary. This is again the cross symbolize the inauspiciousness of violence. And Matara is the opposite of Jaffna. If Jaffna is the Hindu Tamil heartland, Matara is the Buddhist Sinhala heartland. See, colonialism is never far away from contemporary Sri Lankan politics. So all these maps that are, I don't know where they are, it's somewhere here, downstairs, which deals with a fortress, is dealing with a number of things. One is the advent of colonialism and the overall impact it had on the society, including some people like me. I'm supposed to be Buddhist and my name is Portuguese. So that these are lingering kind of impacts. But it also says something here. Here is a lion which symbolizes the Sinhala people, but it is the lion who's now imprisoned in the fort. Because the identities that we are fighting over today were basically 19th century identities that were created in this fashion, right? So he's trying to say that colonialism created some of these things over which, as a result of which, we have now become prisoners. I will only talk about these two because this refers to contemporary. See, again, fortresses and harbors are the things or locations through which ideas came into the country, ideas as well as problems. So colonialism in many ways was an idea as well as a series of problems, right? Now, but of course, he put this picture of Hanuman there too, and that talks about a number of things. One is that this perennial connection with India, there's nothing you can do about it. It's 22 miles across the sea, so that's where it is. The languages we have there came from there, religions came, everything, right? But also, in more recent times, this idea of building a bridge from southern India to Sri Lanka is making people very nervous. So again, because they think there will be uncontrolled flow of people into the country, and there was that kind of thing in the 60s. So this figure now you see in newspaper cartoons and so on. This is very recent. And also there is this thing called some kind of an agreement that the Sri Lankan and Indian government are trying to sign. And there is enormous animosity against this because they think that the Indian goods and services will flood the market. So that is where it is. So he is commenting on something both perennial and something that is very contemporary. So let me get back to my overall argument now. So now you've seen these pictures. What do all these images tell us? Where do they take us intellectually, or do they take us anywhere intellectually, or is it something that is a matter of color? As I said at the beginning, my long-term academic interest is to look at contemporary political art, but not as an artist, not as a general consumer, and not as an art historian, curator, or a gallerist, but as a sociologist. As such, my interest is to explore the possibility of constructing a methodological approach which might go well beyond the frames of reference of these discourses. A question that must be posed at this moment is this: can we assume that art in fact reflects history, politics, or memory in some linear and coherent fashion without contradictions? Is art such a simple text? Can it be accommodated within the supposedly objective research criteria of sociology? I would suggest anywhere in the world, some of the fundamental assumptions of Corso's observations I referred to earlier would have to be reformulated to some extent. For instance, art does reflect history in the sense that all art is produced at a particular historical and political moments within a clear social and cultural geographies and are impacted upon by temporal realities. As such, in many ways, such works are products of that moment in terms of material used, stylistic conventions, and in some genres of work, what is represented. Representational politics is certainly very obvious in political art. This is very clear in Sri Lankan art you have just seen. However, despite that historical location in spatial and temporal terms, art does not always narrate clear histories, as it also does not always capture and transmit coherent memories. In other words, despite the possibility of historically locating a work of art, it does not necessarily visually represent that moment in all of its complexities. But is this any different from other sources of information and discourses that sociologists regularly deal with? As scholars, we are expected to place our material in context, check their validity and sense, theorize the material, and offer interpretations. It seems to me this methodological possibility is well within contemporary art, even though sociology the world over has not realistically assessed its narrative possibilities. Instead, anything to do with the visual in sociology has been expelled to the realm of visual sociology, far away from the mainstream pursuits of the discipline. So there's this push into the something that is a subdiscipline. Based on the kind of thinking I have attempted to outline, In my work dealing with political violence and memory in Sri Lanka over the last 15 to 20 years, I have spent considerable time looking at contemporary political art, particularly the art of the 1990s, the kind of thing you saw, as repositories of memories and violence. I have also talked to people, read through countless documents as conventional sociology has trained me to do and keeps insisting that I do. However, in a country where official records are not always complete or available, where talking to people about their experiences of violence is not as easy as one may think due to both political and ethical considerations, if I had not self-consciously veered somewhat away from the conventional sources of discourse to the less conventional repositories of memory, such as contemporary art, I think my work would have been substantially incomplete. It would have been much less nuanced. In fact, I am convinced no substantial political history of Sri Lanka is possible without this kind of methodological innovations. And my sense is that similar necessities exist elsewhere in South Asia, though conventional sociology is extremely reluctant to make the effort. Part of the problem, it seems to me, is the methodological conservatism that sociology in our part of the world in particular and elsewhere more generally is imprisoned in what appears to be an inherent lack of innovativeness. So I don't see contemporary sociology in our part of the world as particularly innovative in methodological terms. It shows, that is sociology shows, clear trends of being theoretical and methodological followers rather than innovators in these domains. Sociology in South Asia also seems to suffer from a more general fear of the visual, which we also see elsewhere in the world. Besides, in this context, some innovations, if they emerge at all, might well be labeled soft sociology as opposed to hard sociology, represented by the post-1970s influx of statistics into the practice of sociology. So, see, the discipline has become, in my assessment, something that has to be quantifiable. This kind of approach will not be able to do that. In this context, methodological approaches towards possibilities such as contemporary art or photography quite possibly would be seen as an embrace of soft sociology and a matter of compromising the discipline's analytical rigor. So, clearly, these are not conducive circumstances for a discipline to reinvent itself. Working with issues such as violence and politics within my own discipline is about working in fields of emotion among people who are dead, but memories of them might not be. If one opts to take this journey by being conventional sociologists, this can be done, and the road is very clear. The path is obvious. Alternatively, if you decide to do so by becoming slightly innovative, for instance, looking for your answers among fields of visual arts, such as what you have seen, in the midst of other interlocking discourses, you will necessarily transgress worlds of liminality, and the terrain itself would be relatively unexplored and untested. So that is part of the problem. There is a reluctance to go into these kinds of discursive spaces simply because you are not familiar with what to do with it. My hope, finally, is that those who are brave enough to try would have the sense to be innovative as well as cautious at the same time, because it cannot be a situation where anything and everything goes. Thank you. That's it.